Is the Iranian regime on the verge of collapse? Is the United States on the verge of making it collapse? Is there a popular uprising in Iran that could unseat, since 1979, the Mullah regime, or is this something being foisted from the outside which will not succeed? And if there is an attempt at force, will that result in a wider war that could see American bases get attacked and American troops killed for no apparent benefit to our country? These are all very, very important questions that are still very much on the deciding line here, where the decisions have not even been made, but the risks are very high. It's trying to make sense of a lot of this and try to find out what's really going on, because a lot of the narratives that we see in the West very often are either misinformation, disinformation, or incomplete. And we have nobody better than Trita Parsi here, Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, and somebody very, very familiar with the situation in Iran. Trita, welcome back to the show. Been a while since we've had you.
Great to be back. Good to see you again.
Well, listen, let's just get right into it, because one of the news that's hitting the headlines this morning is something that the Iranian President Pezeshkian said last night, that in the event that there was an attack on Iran, at least according to one of the reports that I saw, that we could be at, quote, full-scale war with the United States and Iran if that happens. According to this report here, Iran's president warned on Sunday that any U.S. strike on the country would provoke a harsh response, that any attack on its supreme leader would be tantamount to a full-scale war on the Iranian nation. He seems to distinguish a little bit that a strike on the country or a strike on the supreme leader could result in a full-scale war, and maybe a response, but not that harsh. A harsh response would be if it wasn't the leader. Can you explain what the difference between those two is?
Yeah, so first of all, part of the reason why this is even being discussed, of course, is because there's been open speculation in the US media, and I assume the Iranians believe that it's been speculation or considerations inside the US government, that perhaps a Venezuela can be pulled off in Iran, which would be then to, in this case, take out the supreme leader of Iran. I don't think the US would make an effort to actually go inside Iran and try to kidnap him in the same way that it was done in Venezuela. Much, much more difficult. Also a bad history, as you remember. President Carter did a disastrous rescue attempt to get the hostages out back in 79 or so, and the helicopters crashed, and it was just a disaster. So I think Trump is very unlikely to do that. So it would mean essentially to assassinate the supreme leader. So this is then in response to that. And I think you're putting your finger on something important. There's a differentiation that is apparently being made between a harsh response and a full-scale war. And I think the distinction then is, if the United States were to do another attack against Iran, that would be somewhat symbolic, but it would not be an intent to conduct regime change inside of Iran. Then the Iranian response would be harsh, but nevertheless contained and limited. And most likely it would probably be similar to what we saw in June, in which it was symbolic. They struck an empty base. The US knew 3 days ahead of time that it was going to be attacked. In fact, the Pentagon referred to it as a polite response. If, however, the US goes after the supreme leader, which at the end of the day, the Iranians would interpret as nothing short of a regime change effort, that's when the full-scale war scenario would play in. Whether that is, at the end of the day, the real intent behind that message or not remains unclear, because in the communication between the United States and Iran, messages tend to oftentimes be misunderstood. US intelligence that have listened in on how the Iranians react and discuss American messages that was sent to them were baffled that the Iranians almost always misunderstood the American messages. And I think that there's a fair chance that there's a high degree of misunderstanding of what the Iranians are saying as well. But on the face of it, there seems to be a distinction between these two types of attacks. But I would also have to say that I'm personally would be surprised if the Iranians were to go along with another attack on its soil and then only responding politely, because there is a line of thinking within the government there, which is that every time that has happened and the Iranians have opted not to have a full confrontation with the US, which obviously is something they don't want, they know they can't win it, but nevertheless, it just gradually weakens them and makes it easier and easier for the United States to ultimately go for regime change or a full-scale war. So that, at the end of the day, what seems to be a short-term respite in the long term actually makes the situation for the Iranians worse. Given that line of thinking, I'm not so sure if the actual intent behind that message was to make such a big distinction between these two different scenarios.
And I guess a lot of that would depend on the scale of the attack, even if it wasn't on the Ayatollah himself, if it was on some of the regime or some of the other infrastructure. I guess it would depend. Tell me if you think I'm right or wrong on how strong it was. Like if it was something that was also symbolic on our end and didn't cause any real damage, then maybe it would get a polite response potentially. But if it's something heavier, I think that, or I'm asking actually, would we expect a heavier Iranian response?
Well, these type of polite exchanges don't happen accidentally. There was communication between the U.S. government and the Iranian government ahead of Trump's attack on the Fordo nuclear facilities. The facilities were completely emptied of personnel. And this was done precisely because Trump wanted to signal, I'm going to do this, but I don't want to have further escalation. The question is, under these circumstances, can that arrangement even be made? And what would the benefit be for the United States if it were to even take that step ultimately? Moreover, at the end of the day, the attack on Fordo was not a polite attack from the US side. At the end of the day, it completely destroyed that facility. Whether it obliterated the nuclear program as a whole is a different story. But that specific facility was destroyed and had cost the Iranians a tremendous amount to build it. So how many more of those type of exchanges can the Iranians afford in which something very valuable to them is destroyed and they respond politely by attacking an empty base in which there's no significant damage that really is made? So again, whereas that has been the pattern in the past for one or two or three times, it doesn't seem likely to me that the Iranians are going to continue to agree to that, because every time they do, their own deterrence is hollowed out and their actual red line eventually is going to be misunderstood and lost because they just never respond forcefully back. So given all of that, I'm not so sure whether the message actually was that there is a distinction. It may on the surface come across as that, but I'm not so sure that it was.
I see. I want to look at the proximal cause of this current spate here, and that is these protests that started somewhere around the 28th, 29th of December, which I'm sure was entirely coincidental, the same day that Benjamin Netanyahu met with Trump in Mar-a-Lago. And then after that, all these protests began. I wonder, I want to try to figure out what the truth is, because there is a dueling narrative here that the West, most of the Western media is saying that this was all organic, that it was all about domestic upheaval in the economic system, that they blamed the government for not taking care of them economically. And so they're protesting, and then the protests or the government overreacted and killed thousands of protesters, et cetera. On the inside, they're saying, no, this was externally fomented, and whatever unhappiness was on the ground was fomented intentionally from the outside, and that's what caused a lot of the violence. And so what's the ground truth here?
Reality is oftentimes not as neat as either one of those different narratives. I think in the early stages of this was an organic protest. Whether it was triggered organically or not is not a binary situation, because at the end of the day, this is a result of the currency collapsing, but also certain reforms that the Pezeshkian government was pushing through, having communicated it in a rather insufficient way, causing a shock to the population, or at least to the traders, etc., who were immediately affected by it. And then they went out completely organically and started protesting. But those protests are very different from what we saw a couple of days later. In fact, for some time, about a week or so, the protests were still very low scale. They were not at all at the large scale that we see. They were spreading fast throughout the country, particularly in certain border areas and poorer regions. It actually caught on very fast. The response of the government at the time was not this brutal. In some aspects, it was even a bit restrained. But then things change around January 8th. That's when you suddenly have a huge amount of people coming out at night. And that's when you also see the Iranians then closing down the internet completely. All of these Starlinks, etc., turn out not to be effective at all because I don't know what technology the Iranians are using, but they're essentially successfully jamming them and making it very difficult for anyone to get any insight into what's happening inside the country. And that's also when the very, very brutal clampdown from the government took place. The exact number of people dead is not entirely clear. I know some of the latest numbers are now around 5,000, but that appears to also include another element. This is also new, which is that 500 or so of the dead are policemen and Basij members, meaning members of this militia that is there to support the regime. That is a completely new phenomenon. We have not seen level of violence from the protesters at this level at all, with this type of a deadly result in any way, shape, or form. Whether that is entirely homegrown or not, of course, is a question that doesn't yet have a clear answer. Obviously, the Iranian government says that it isn't, but then again, they say that about almost anything that happens and are constantly accusing protesters of being fomented from the outside. But in this specific case, you also have a scenario in which the Israelis are openly saying in their own media, including Israeli officials, that they have a role in this, that they have helped, that they have brought in weapons and things of that nature. So,
Well, in fact,
even
Mike Pompeo was joining with that crowd. Gary, if you could put that full screen up
exactly.
there.
Yeah.
He says here, Happy New Year to every Iranian in the streets, also to every Mossad agent walking beside them. I mean,
Yeah.
this seems to be pretty cocky to me that you would want to admit that, because doesn't this seem to support what the Iranian regime is actually claiming?
Well, it could also be psychological warfare in which it actually isn't true, but they're saying it in order to essentially put the Iranian government in a more desperate and confused situation. And perhaps because they wanted an Iranian overreaction, which they got. And that overreaction is then used as a pretext for US foreign military intervention. Again, we don't know. The fact that the Israelis are saying it openly is a completely new element. It makes it much more difficult to just dismiss out of hand that this is that there isn't at least an element of the protest, and I think a small element, not at all in any way, shape, or form, a majority that have support from the outside. But it also doesn't mean 100% that that is true, because just because they're saying it is not evidence in and of itself. They may very well have an interest in saying it because they want some form of a reaction. But on the other hand, given the large number of deaths on the police side as well, that is just completely unprecedented in the Iranian situation. And mindful of the fact that Iran is not a country like the United States in which weapons are readily available, it makes it even more surprising that you would have that level of deaths. But I think it's important to understand there's no smoking gun in either direction. It's just a lot of different phenomenon that we simply have not seen before. One last point. When the protests first began, as I mentioned, they were not particularly large. The portrayal of them on social media and in some Western media, however, already made them look much, much larger back then. Later on, they became massive, undoubtedly. But in the beginning, they were not that big, but they were portrayed as very big. And I think that was part of the Israeli campaign to convince Trump that the regime is about to fall. All he needs to do is to take a small action, just a little bit of a push. He will be the hero, the regime will fall, and he will have a second success after Venezuela in very short order. And of course, Trump was on a bit of a sugar high from Venezuela and probably was quite receptive to that line of argument. But at the time when that argument was being made, those protests were not that large. Later on, they became absolutely massive. There's no doubt about that.
Which but then that gets to the question of, and we're going to get to this in just a minute, of why there wasn't an attack, because all the military pieces seem to be lined up that there was going to be. I don't want to jump ahead here. First of all, though, I want to ask your opinion though about one issue. Gary just had a headline up there a second ago about a lot of these alleged executions hanging in Iran. That's one of the things that Trump said. If they hang 800 people, then he said, that's going to be my red line. I'm going to go in and attack then. But then apparently, I don't know if it was hanging happened. Trump said that he talked to somebody in Iran. Iran said that they're not going to do it. Now, apparently, they're saying, well, maybe we will. What can you tell us about how that works inside of Iran with this so-called execution by hanging of terrorists, as they call them?
Yeah, so I think it's first important to recognize that the narrative of the Iranian government is that this was January 8th, essentially, was day 13 of the Israeli war on Iran. As you remember, in June of last year, the war went on for 12 days. The Israelis made it very clear from the outset that they did not consider the war over. As we talked about last time, they did not achieve their objectives, and they were openly saying that they were going to attack again. And in fact, this was on top of the agenda when Netanyahu went and visited with Trump at the White House on December 29th. So the Iranian narrative, the government narrative, is that this was day 13. This was the Israelis restarting the war. And in that context, yes, it wouldn't be surprising at all if they were to go ahead with a large number of executions, given their track record and given the number of people that already have been killed. The extent to which this has been stopped because of anything Trump said, etc., I think is pure speculation. But I think Trump, of course, was looking for an exit. He was looking for an exit ramp because he had already threatened to attack even earlier than that. And could not live up to his words. The Iranians completely disregarded him because they did clamp down on January 8th and 9th, and Trump had warned them not to. In fact, a lot of things that Trump have said have not been responded to either by the Iranian government or by the Iranian protesters. He called for them to continue to protest and take over their institutions. None of that has happened. There's been other voices like the son of the Shah who did call for protest on January 8th. He wasn't the only one. He's taking credit for those large numbers. It's not clear to me if that is fully deserved, but to a certain extent, it certainly is deserved. But then he also called for strikes in the oil industry. None of that has happened. He's been calling for protests in the last 2 evenings with people going out in the evening and shouting from the rooftops, etc. A little bit safer type of protest. And to the best of my knowledge, and I just spoken to some people who have been in contact with people inside of Iran, none of that has happened either. So there's a lot of folks that are trying to take credit for what is happening, claim leadership. It's not clear to me that they have that leadership, but neither does Trump have the ability to really move the protesters at this point or the Iranian government itself.
And let's take a look at that, because the issue with I believe his name is Reza, the offspring of the Shah. There's been a lot of talk in the West that, hey, how's about we put that guy in there? Then he would be really friendly to the West, and that would be great. So if we knock out the Mullah regime, then he will be able to step in, and that would be great for us. Would it be great for us? And would the Iranian people actually follow him?
First, I simply don't think it will happen. And he's been promoted primarily by the Israelis. In fact, if you take a look at some of these monarchist protests outside of Iran, in LA or other places, I mean, there's almost more Israeli flags than there are Iranian flags at those protests. So the manner in which the son of the Shah has really intertwined himself with the Israelis is unprecedented. He has tried for a very long time, and he has actually been rebuffed by the Israelis themselves. But this has now changed. It actually changed a couple of years ago. As you may remember, he visited Israel. He was met at the airport by the Minister of Intelligence. And at this point, even in his plan that he pointed out what he would do if the regime were to fall and he were to take over, he said that on day one, he would immediately normalize relations with Israel. Even the Shah, his father, never normalized relations with Israel. He had de facto very close relations, but he refused to give formal recognition of Israel, de jure recognition and normalization, until the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was resolved. So would this be better for the West? Bottom line, I just don't see any scenario in which he would take over. And the reason for that is not that he doesn't have pockets of support. He does have support in the diaspora. He does have a support, probably somewhat limited, but growing inside of Iran amongst young, very desperate people who have a certain degree of nostalgia for the Shah's day, even though they never actually experienced it themselves. But he does not have any sign of support from within the security establishment. And in the absence of that, it's just really difficult to see that this very entrenched regime would fall and they would hand over the keys to Reza Pahlavi, who for the last 47 years really haven't done much. In fact, he's not even trying to build a coalition of Iranians inside of Iran or with other political groupings or opposition groups. Instead, which was what you would do if you're actually trying to do a bottom-up revolution and overthrow the government in Iran. What he's trying to do is to say to Trump, pick me, install me from above, because the messaging is almost exclusively to Trump and not to the Iranian people, or at a minimum in the sense of building coalitions. Yes, he gives messages in Persian, etc., but that's not enough in order to do a revolution, of course. And I think he's very worried about the fate of the Venezuelan Nobel Peace Prize winner, who also thought that she was going to be picked and she was going to be installed from above, and instead Trump decided to go with Maduro's number 2 instead. And his justification primarily was that there was a lack of faith that she had the ability to control the security establishment and security forces, and that she didn't have enough support amongst them. Whatever she had is way more than what Reza Pahlavi has in Iran. And I think this is one of those challenges that he is faced with, and he's desperately trying to say, I can move the people. Look, I told them to go out and protest on January 8th, and they heeded my call. Yes, to a certain extent, others did that as well. But then he's made several other calls, and those have not been heeded at all.
Yeah, in any case, it doesn't look like it's. I don't see a lot of justification to suggest that has a much plausibility. But even before you could even theorize about whether that could happen, first of all, the regime itself would have to collapse. And the question is really the central question at the moment is how firm, how strong is the regime actually? Now, there was an IRGC general a few days back that made a public statement in Persian. That was translated with subtitles into English, where I think that was a primary target. He's saying, listen, if you attack us, he seemed to not make a distinction whether it was the country or the Ayatollah. He says, if you attack us, we're going to attack American bases in the area. Watch this.
ما توصیه میکنیم عقب برید، دیگه بیشتر از این جلو نیایید. ما اگر راه بیفتیم ما دیگه بحث آتش بس و این چیزا نداریم ها. ما هم الان به صراحت بهتون میگیم این ضرباتی که زدید، این خساراتی که تو این 50 سال وارد کردید، این هرچه ما داریم نجابت و صبر راهبردی به خرج میدیم شما توجه نمیکنید. ما اگه دوباره بیفتیم رو اون دوره دفاع مقدس جنگ از سال دوم به بعد، مطمئن باشید مشکلات جدی برای شما پیدا میشه. تا همینجا متوقف کنید، برگردید. ملت ایرانی ملت بسیار با شعور، نجیب، دنبال جنگ نیست، ولی اگه به اون نقطه برسه که دیگه باید کار رو تمام بکنه، حوادث دیگری به اتفاق میفته. البته ما برادریمون و دوستیمون رو با عربستان حفظ میکنیم، با امارات، با بحرین، با قطر، با ترکیه، با عراق، اما هیچ پایگاهی از شما تو این کشورها امن نخواهد بود.
Now, is that just braggadocious kind of say, hey, we'll attack all your bases, or does Iran actually have the capacity to make good on that?
Well, Danny, you're much more of a military analyst than I am, so you should probably answer that question. I'll just give you my less informed take of it. The Iranians do have clearly missile capabilities that can reach all of those bases. They can reach Israel. In fact, they have a much larger number of short-range missiles that are sufficient to reach most of the bases in the Persian Gulf. Those missiles also obviously take less time to reach them than what they did to Israel. And in the Israeli case, despite the fact that the Israelis have the Arrow 1, 2, and 3, the David Sling, the Iron Dome, the Patriots, as well as the THAAD system, 2 batteries that were moved there by the Biden administration, nevertheless, it led to a scenario in which the Iranians had an increasing success rate of getting their missiles through. Moreover, when they struck the base in Qatar, that was also with the US air defense systems, and they got several missiles through there as well. I believe one of them did hit one of the intelligence buildings at the base. So we do know that they have the capability of reaching and penetrating all of the air defense systems, including the best American air defense systems. Now, if the US were to attack, my suspicion would be that the aim would be to, as fast as possible, destroy as many of these missile sites and batteries and launchers as possible so that the Iranians never would manage to shoot a large number of them. But we have seen that when they have the time and the space to do so, they do it, they can hit it, they can get through. Of course, last time, as I mentioned, they had already given a warning with 3 days' notice, so the US had already vacated that base. Going forward, this is part of their deterrence against an American attack. In fact, it is their last deterrence. Their
Well, and
previous
that's really the
deterrence.
question. Yeah, you're right. There's no question that they have the physical capacity militarily. That's been proven. That's been demonstrated.
Yeah.
The question is, though, the political decision to do that, to not give this 3-day advance notice you mentioned, to not intentionally seek an empty base, but to seek one instead that will cause death and destruction and real harm to the United States. What do you think is the line to where Iran would say, I'm willing to go past this to actually do harm, as opposed to trying the polite way, as you put it a while ago?
Well, if we go back to what Pezeshkian's statement was essentially that if this is a regime change operation, then they'll go all out. And one of the things I think they will calculate in that situation is that they still know they're not going to win the war, but they have a different metric of success. If they can destroy Trump's presidency before they lose the war, they think that that will end up meaning that Trump will back off without the Iranians actually having fully been defeated, similar to what happened with the Houthis. The Houthis kept on striking back. They never backed down. On several occasions, they almost took down some American jets. And 2 jets were lost, not because of direct hits, but because of incoming attack. And we saw that after 6-8 weeks, Trump kind of grew tired of it, pulled out entirely, claimed that he had managed to achieve something, and then even went on to say that those Houthis are a really tough bunch of kids or a tough bunch of nuts. So there is a blueprint of how you get Trump to back down. And I think that's what the Iranians would aim for, which would be to go after these bases, etc. The trigger, of course, is certainly if there is a war attempt that the Iranians interpret as regime change, and this is essentially their final stance, but it may also be at a much lower threshold than that, given their past experience in which when they have agreed to these polite exchanges, ultimately it has weakened them and it has weakened their deterrence.
And how much damage was done to Iran in the June attack of last year, the 12-day war?
Oh, there was significant damage done, and you had more than 1,000 civilians being killed. You had 30, just in the first 12 hours, 30 senior commanders and officials from the military, and as well as the nuclear program, including their families and neighbors, that were killed. And nevertheless, despite that massive, massive blow, the military there was not paralyzed for more than a couple of hours, and within 12 hours, they started shooting back. So I think, again, we're looking at a system that is entrenched, that is a revolutionary system that was designed to be able to withstand a counter-revolution. And as a result, taking out a couple of key figures proved completely insufficient to actually overthrow the regime, or collapse the regime, which was the aim of the Israelis back then. The US, of course, has far greater capabilities, etc. But to believe that this is going to be another Venezuela or something like that is just pure fantasy, I think. And again, the Iranians, as you mentioned, they have the capability. The only reason why they haven't used it so far is because they made a political decision not to use it.
And is there a line, do you perceive, where that's a pretty substantial pain that they suffered in June, and still were pretty restrained in their target selection and what they went after, a little bit more painful on the Israeli side. But is there a line that we could cross, and even, it's pretty evident if it's the Ayatollah, I think that line's crossed. But is there anything even less than that, to where there could be enough pain to where the political decision in Iran could finally be, there's no benefit, there's no value for us to be restrained. Now it's better for us to cause as much pain as we can, as a new level of deterrent? Is that a possible line, or do you think they'll stay in this?
No,
we'll
I
take a
think,
lot of heat.
I think there's that line there's a lot of room for miscalculation here. And again, I think you can either have the two sides miscalculating or misunderstanding what the other side's intent is. The Iranians may interpret a certain attack as a regime change effort, even though that may not have been the intent of the Trump administration. And as a result, react as if it is, and then we have a full-scale war. You can also have this other scenario that I mentioned, which is that even if the next attack is not a regime change attack, nevertheless, the trajectory is that every time the US does this, and the US does this because the US doesn't think Iran will strike back hard, it just constantly invites more attacks. And the only way you stop that is to actually hit back disproportionately, but in a much harsher way than in the past, to be able to break that cycle. This is part of the reason that if the Israelis were to attack again, I think it was very clear that the Iranians were going to attack very harshly from the very beginning of the war to completely dispel the notion that Iran could be treated as Syria or Lebanon, a country that Israel just mows the grass, as they themselves say it, every 6 or so months. But of course, with the United States, much more powerful military, the Iranians have been much more careful. But if they feel that existential threat, and if they feel that that trajectory puts them in a situation in which 6 months from now, a year from now, 2 years from now, if they keep on responding politely, all they're doing is just inviting more attacks, then you may end up seeing a much harsher response already now, despite the fact that Trump may not have intended to go all out.
Can the United States and Israel, let's just say those two together, with our substantial military power, can we defeat Iran just using missile power without actually having boots on the ground?
We don't have any example of regime change happening as a result of just air war. And given the fact that the Iranians do have an ability to respond, I don't think it would be even similar to other cases in which, the US essentially owned the skies entirely and nevertheless could not do regime change without having its own troops or other troops on the ground. So no, I don't think that is a scenario, but I think a likely scenario to succeed. But it is not an unlikely scenario to be favored by the Israelis. At the end of the day, the Israelis are not looking for a specifically different regime. They're looking to make sure that Iran's military capability is so degraded. In fact, if the country descends into chaos and civil war, even better, because that completely removes Iran from the geopolitical chessboard. And that is what the Israeli objective at the end of the day is.
But see, I would argue that that's really short-sighted, because if you don't get a civil war, it seems to me that they could. You mentioned a second ago that they could use the Houthis model, to where we just have to remain viable and we can suck down a lot of missiles and we can have a lot of but if you don't send ground forces in, you're not going to take us over, and we'll remain a thorn in your side all the way through. And then till later we can rebuild our power, and it'll be a constant threat. So I got this question of you.
Unless you have a scenario in which the Israelis, because of infiltration, whether it is support for Kurdish groups right now that have made some attacks on the border areas, managed to get Iran into a civil war type of a situation in which its power is consumed internally. And the Israelis have even said it on Channel 14, Netanyahu's channel. They said as soon as the regime falls, or after the regime falls, they said, after the regime falls, that's when the massive bombing campaign should begin. So we're talking about a scenario. In fact, they specifically said the same scenario as in Syria. 20 minutes after Assad boarded the plane to Moscow, the Israeli commentator said, that's when Israel turned all of Syria into a shooting range. And that's the model they said they should use in Iran. And they said also that they hope that the US does the same thing, which means after the regime is gone, that's when the real bombing begins, because that's when you want to take out all of the military capabilities of the country to make sure that for the next 3, 4, 5 decades, Iran can never be a challenge to Israel's design for domination in the region.
That's a big hope that you could get, and a lot of risk that it doesn't work out that way. Let me ask you a different question. Is there another scenario, diplomatic one, to where Israel could have, if not peace, at least stable relations with Iran, where they wouldn't have to worry about an attack, or they wouldn't have to worry about going to war every some number of years, et cetera, to where they could have peace? Or is this the only path for stable relations between Iran and Israel?
Look, I think that all boils down to Israel's own military doctrine. Again, you're the expert here, Danny, but countries generally tend to define threats as a combination of capability and intent. In the Israeli case, they only look at capability. They assume that the intent always is to destroy Israel. And as a result, their only way to safety is through domination, making sure that they outgun every entity in the region, or any entity, a combination of entities in the region that have the capacity of reaching Israel, or otherwise are or outside of the orbit of the United States. So we're not talking about countries like Jordan and Egypt, etc., who wouldn't be able to go to war with Israel because the United States would put their military at complete standstill if they did. So as long as that is the mentality on the Israeli side, I don't see any real scenario in which they will accept some sort of a relationship with Iran, as long as the Iranians have the capability of challenging Israel's maneuverability and domination in the region. An Israeli general told me himself in Israel, this is years ago, he said, Iran was once a friend, and then it turned into an enemy. And it can turn into a friend again. But we have to be aware that if it turns into a friend again, it can turn into an enemy after that. And as a result, our focus should not be on who's in charge, but what capabilities Iran have. As long as that is the mindset on the Israeli side, then I don't think the Israelis will accept any type of a relationship with Iran unless it is subjugated. And that subjugation can be that it is, a pro-American Iran that is, completely dependent on the United States, similar to many of the Arab countries around Israel, or it could be one that is just completely defeated. But take a look at how the Israelis immediately began looking at Turkey as the new big threat to them, as soon as the Turks won in Syria with Assad's fall, and you saw how the Israeli and the Turkish spheres of influence really clashed into each other. And in the case of Turkey, we're talking about a NATO country. But just as in 1991, when the Israelis suddenly started talking about Iran as the threat, despite the fact that throughout the entire 1980s, they were lobbying for Iran in Washington, D.C., and we can go into the details of that if you want. In 1991, when the geopolitical circumstances changes, suddenly the Israelis were starting to talk about Iran as a major threat, despite the fact that they were pushing the U.S. in the Iran-Contra scandal, for instance, to arm the Iranians. And we see the same scenario as soon as Assad fell and the Israelis felt a little bit more comfortable vis-a-vis Hezbollah. They started talking about Turkey as the big threat. Listen to what a lot of the pro-Israeli voices in Washington are saying right now. Erdogan is the most dangerous person in the Middle East. So you're already seeing that a country that otherwise even has diplomatic relations with Israel immediately will be seen as the big threat to the Israelis because it does have the capability to be able to challenge Israel, because its sphere of influence is growing, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it goes back to the original military doctrine, security doctrine of the Israelis, in which they believe that their only path to security is through domination.
Now, I can, whether I agree with it or not, I can certainly see where many would have that view. And you said a second ago something really important. It's a combination of capability and intent. Now, one of the things that's an article of faith in the United States is that Iran, their intent is the destruction of Israel, and that is what they are obsessed with, etc. Here is Lindsey Graham laying exactly that case out a few days ago.
The idea we're dealing with the most vicious regime on the planet who desires to destroy the state of Israel, kill us, purify Islam, make it radical from every pole to every pole, is not a distraction. To people who follow this, if you don't understand this is the biggest moment for change since the fall of the Berlin Wall, you're missing a lot.
Is that true? Does Iran live to destroy Israel?
Let me first say, I love the fact that you guys have a warning sign every time you're quoting Lindsey Graham. I think that is something CNN and everyone else should. Yeah, it's a public service. No, it is not true. And I think 3 heads of Mossad in a row are on record saying Iran is not an existential threat to Israel. Iran is a threat, not an existential threat. Former Prime Minister and Defense Minister Ehud Barak has been on record saying that for almost 20 years, even saying that saying such a thing actually diminishes Israel's own power. They're in no way, shape, or form belittling the Iranian threat. In fact, Ehud Barak was far more eager to go to war with Iran than Netanyahu was. But nevertheless, calling it an existential threat or seeking its destruction, that's a different story. That's the kind of simplification you need to make in order to make the situation as black and white as possible to force the hand of the United States to support a war. If you want to go to war, nuance is the worst thing that you possibly could do. You want to do away with all of those nuances. You want to simplify things. They're looking for Israel's destruction. These people are religious radicals. He said a couple of other things in that interview in later sound bites that are just, saying that this is a religious war, etc. It's the kind of language you need to use if you want to mobilize towards war. But it is precisely if it was, if the case for war was that obvious, there would not be a need for him to use exaggerations of this kind.
And I do want to talk about a couple of other things she said in that interview, because one of them, which you alluded to earlier, that the claim is that we were on the verge somewhere around the 14th of January, for an attack to launch the United States was going to. And then all of a sudden we didn't. And Trump started sounding very conciliatory, when before he had been very, very red line-ish kind of thing. If you kill people, here we come. We may have to knock them down and all this. And then it really changed where, okay, well, now they said they're not going to kill anybody, no executions or whatever. And a lot of the concern was, or the claim was that Arab regimes talked Trump out of doing it. And then another one came out and said, well, it's actually Netanyahu that talked him out of it. Well, in that interview, Lindsey Graham was asked that question about, did the Arab regimes talk Trump out of it?
If the media reports are true, that the Arab countries intervened on behalf of Iran to stop decisive action that was promised, that if the Arab countries are okay with Iran's Ayatollah staying in power, and they feel like the slaughter of people we've encouraged to go out into the streets is not necessary to stop, then they're not a very good ally. I'm going to reevaluate my entire opinion of the Arab World Alliance.
What do you think?
Wait a minute.
Way? Don't you think there's another way to
No.
remove the Ayatollah as you
No. He's not going to be removed other than he either leaves because he thinks he's going to die, or he comes to an end. To the Arab world, I've tried to be very hopeful to build on the Abraham Accords. But this idea of saying one thing behind closed doors and something else in public is coming to an end. So I've called Arab allies, and I said, you need to correct the record. If you did, in fact, intervene to stop this action, that means you really don't understand what America's interests are and your own interest. How can you ask President Trump to do that after he's encouraged people to go out in the streets, risk their own lives? That is such a narrow view and a distorted view, and quite frankly, a sick view of what to do.
A sick view. Now, that term did come to my mind, but for a slightly different reason than he's saying, because he's saying, first of all, how dare the Arabs have a position, and how dare they want peace in their region and want to try to talk Trump out of it. But the second thing is, it's also interesting, Trita, and I'll point this out, is that Trump also was asked that same question, and he says, no, nobody talked me out of it. I talked myself out of it because I wanted to do this. So here is Lindsey Graham, a senior member of the Senate, talking a lot of smack about the Arabs and how we may need to reevaluate just because they said something. But it's President Trump who made the call one way or the other. How do you see that?
So first of all, I think Lindsey Graham is trying to really elevate any comments that binds Trump to action as high as possible in order to make sure that essentially if Trump doesn't act on those threats, he loses credibility. So this is all a pressure campaign by Lindsey Graham. The idea that the Arabs shouldn't have a say in this or that they don't know what their own interests are is, of course, a bit laughable. Reality is that their interest is increasingly the polar opposite of the interest of Lindsey Graham and the pro-Israeli elements that he is increasingly coming across as a spokesperson of it. So let me take a step back. What has happened in the, there's two categories of reasons as to why the Arab states, Pakistan and Turkey, did not want to see military action by Trump. The first one is the obvious one, the one that always has been there, but has not necessarily always been decisive. It is the fact that it would be destabilizing for the region as a whole. They don't have any faith that there would be a new stable government in Iran, forget about it being democratic. And as a result, instability would spread throughout the region, similar in the manner that Iraq's instability spread. And then, of course, in the case of Iran, it's the country 3 times the population, twice the size. So it's even more dangerous for them. On top of that, you have ethnic groups in the border areas, many of them pursuing or having secessionist movements within them. For the Turks, the Kurds are obviously a problem. To see the Kurds, breaking free from Iranian territory, etc., would be a disaster. For the Pakistanis, the Baluchis, etc. So they're seeing a scenario in which they don't see stability coming out of this, and they're terrified that the Israelis do want to see a civil war. They do want to see a failed state in Iran, and they would then pay the price for it. Israel will not pay the price for it. None of the refugees in the region flee to Israel.
Yeah.
Syria was just on the border of Israel. How many Syrians fled to Israel? Almost none. They fled to other Arab countries. They fled to Turkey. They fled to Europe. They did not flee to the country that is right on their border, which is Israel. And so the same thing would happen in this scenario. People would not be fleeing to Israel. So Israel, in some ways, completely insulated from the instability in the region that this would cause. So that's one factor. But that factor has always been there. And at times the Arabs have weighed things differently and were willing to risk that. There's another factor I think is decisive as to why many of them are now opposed to this, to the extent that they're weighing in and lobbying directly for Trump not to do this. MBS spoke directly to Trump about this, and the others conveyed their messages in a very, very intense manner. And that is the fact that ever since Biden completely lifted all of the constraints on Israel, Israel's conduct in the region has just become completely reckless and dangerous and a threat to all of these different states. Israel has bombed 7 countries in the region since October 7th. And in the past, the constraints imposed by the US were not very great, but at least there were some constraints. Now they're all taken off. Trump has followed the same pattern. And as a result, the Israelis even went as far and bombed Doha and Qatar. So that then gives these countries a wake-up call. If your alliance with the United States is not sufficient to protect you from the Israelis bombing you, then you need another configuration to be able to balance against the Israelis, because you cannot rely on the United States to do so. So what do? Well, they're coming together. This is why you see a coalition now being formed between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. Pakistan offered its nuclear umbrella to Saudi. Turkey seems to be walking into that as well. And this is all because in this new configuration where Iran is much weakened, the US has taken off the constraints on Israel. These countries see Israel as a direct threat, and the buffer that Iran tended to provide against that, because of so much energy being sucked up by Iran, by Israel, is now gone. And if it's even further gone, it further becomes a blow to their efforts to try to find a way to balance against Israel, particularly if there is an effort either to have the state completely collapse or to put in a puppet that would be pro-Israeli. That would be a huge blow to these countries who are increasingly viewing Israel as the threat in the region rather than Iran. And I think we should mention, these states do not have any positive view of the Iranian regime. They have been in deep rivalries with it. They fought each other. This is not a favor to Iran in any way, shape, or form. This is their fear of what would happen in the region beyond the instability, but also the geopolitical configuration if this then further advances Israel's designs, as they say it and they see it, of hegemony in the region. Now, of course, that is exactly what someone like Lindsey Graham wants. That's what he's seeking, and he's seeking these countries to essentially subjugate themselves to Israel by joining the Abraham Accord. But we're seeing more and more of these states are not in the mood of doing that because they see Israel as a threat.
Well, in fact, that's the last thing in the remaining amount of time we have here. I want to look at one last thing Lindsey Graham says, because he is looking to bypass any kind of resistance at all to an attack. And so he's I don't know if he's choosing to interpret or if he knows something inside because he's a golfing buddy of Trump's, but he seems to suggest that this delay was not because he was eventually talked out of it, but only because they want to go in bigger to make sure that they get a regime change deal.
I just gave a statement this morning that the headlines you see about President Trump lacking resolve are absolutely not accurate. The question about these operations, do they get bigger or smaller? So my belief is that the regime's days are numbered. I feel more optimistic about that today than at any time in recent memory. So you will just follow my activity the next day or two, and we'll see. But the idea that you don't understand, this is literally the most, if Iran falls and the Ayatollah falls, the largest response to terrorism in the Mideast is no more. There's no help for Hezbollah, Hamas.
But
Then wait a minute, the likelihood of the region going in a new direction goes great.
Well, let's just talk about that last. Do you see any scenario to where if we go in militarily, destroy the Iranian regime, that something really good comes out of it?
I mean, look, we were sold those lies in Iraq, and we saw exactly where that went. So anyone who is open to being convinced by this, I really don't know what can be done about that. Reality, of course, is very, very different. And again, the regional states see this. Israel, of course, has a very different interest. And the proximity between Lindsey Graham and Israel, of course, is very obvious at this point. But you know, I think there's something that is true in what he's saying. I do think that this is not over, that Trump has mobilized further troops, sending all kinds of aircraft carriers to the region, has vacated almost all of the bases in the region, which was not the case in June. Many of them were vacated, but not all of them. But now it seems like all of them are being vacated. And as a result, very much seems to be preparing himself for a military attack. And again, this goes back to our earlier conversation. Is it a bluff? Is it aimed at, you know, getting the Iranians to agree to a polite exchange, or is it something much bigger than that? And it's not set yet. I think in many ways, Trump doesn't make these decisions until the last minute. There's some reporting that says that Israel lobbied against it. I find that to be very misleading. I think the Israelis lobbied for a delay. They did not lobby against it, which is different from what the Arab position and the Turkish position was. They were lobbying for a delay because of their own readiness and preparedness and things of that nature, rather than lobbying for Trump not to do it at all. In fact, Netanyahu went to Mar-a-Lago to lobby him to do it. The timeline, etc., is a different story. But the fact that the Israelis want the United States to go to war with Iran, Netanyahu has been pushing for this for 25 years. The idea that he suddenly changed his mind is just completely unconvincing. It's all about the timing and the scale.
Netanyahu is calculated, because you mentioned a minute ago that with the Iron Dome, David Sling, all the different, the THAADs, the Patriots, all the different things that Israel has, was not good enough to stop Iran in June of last year. It's probably less capable right now because the Iranian missiles, by some reports, some of their best stuff was held in reserve and could come down. That is, Netanyahu understands. To ask for a delay is just a delay, but that's not going to change the fact that if there is a war, that Israel's going to take some in the teeth. I mean, do you think that he's willing to take some of the teeth if he believes that there's going to be enough combat power to take them out?
Exactly. Also, already in June, I don't think the Israelis would have opted for a ceasefire if they thought Trump was willing to join the war fully. Once it became clear to them that Trump was just going to do a one-off, he was just going to go after the nuclear site and then say that everything is now awesome and now we need to end the war. At that point, the cost-benefit analysis of continuing the war became a negative one for the Israelis because of the hits they were taking. But if the U.S. was going to come in with its full military force, the Israelis, I think Netanyahu in particular, would be happy to absorb those costs because the gain would have been perceived to be much, much better based on their calculation. And I think today is the same scenario. Yes, you know, the fact that they were taking hits from Iran is not a reason for the Israelis not to start the war again. It's the reason for them to start the war again, because their objective is to make sure that Iran does not have the capability to deter Israel, just like none of the other states in its immediate vicinity has that. Look what the U.S. is doing in Lebanon. We are strengthening the Lebanese armed forces to the point that they can defeat Hezbollah, but not to the point that they can deter Israel. So we want to keep them weak enough so that Israel has complete maneuverability. And it doesn't have that vis-a-vis Iran, which is the reason why it needs to restart the war. Now, if it can get the US to do it for it, then obviously it's going to be much more favorable in that direction, given the firepower that the US can bring in. The question is, and this has kind of been completely lost in all of this, where's America first in all of this?
Yes, yes, we pointed about that. It doesn't exist, and I mean, they just give the thinnest of excuses. It's yeah, well, because it's Israel, so somehow that's America first. I don't know how they make that, but it seems to work with some of the supporters. It's just not true, and it's demonstrably not true. We'll see. I'm afraid if Trump doesn't listen to reason, if he doesn't listen to these Arab regimes, we may find out just how bad it can be. But in any case, really appreciate you coming on today. You've really illuminated this in ways that few others have. And at least we know what we're up against. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Dan.
And we appreciate you guys too. We're going to come back later this afternoon because there's some issue. Well, you know, also to remind you that we are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Podcast Addict. We're also on Substack. If you like the written word, make sure you share that with your friends. Folks, be sharing this stuff because, again, a lot of great stuff you just saw here. You don't see it on other channels. Like this video, subscribe, and pass it along if you haven't. All of that really makes a big difference and helps us spread this message in every way that we can. And we ask you to participate in that as well. We're going to be back later this afternoon. A lot of things going on in not just the Russia-Ukraine war, but also in the Greenland issue with NATO. And are we laying the seeds for the dissolution, if not the rupture, of the transatlantic alliance? There's some new information out overnight that you're not going to want to miss. That will be at 2:30 this afternoon. We will see you then on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.